Okay, hi. This is a video on William Faulkner's Light in August. This is the fourth Faulkner book that I've read, and it might be my favorite. The other ones I've read were The Sound and the Fury, Absalom, Absalom, and As I Lay Dying. I would say that this is definitely not the hardest Faulkner. If you're feeling intimidated, you want to try to get into Faulkner, this would be a good place to start. As I Lay Dying would be my other recommendation, but so far this one to me seems to be the most accessible. It's a fairly traditional, it's a understandable, linear, mostly narrative with relatable and tragic characters. Faulkner a lot of times gets into some jumping around in the time periods and confusing stream of consciousness, and I love all that about him, but it was really nice to have this more straightforward story from him, still written with really well-crafted prose and interesting themes and characters. So yeah, I did really enjoy this book. So the theme, I mean, there's a lot of ideas happening here, but what I kind of landed on as the thesis statement, as it were, was that the danger of external perception is that it forms internal identity. So what we see a lot of in this book is people letting society or those around them decide who they are, and accepting that identity that's given to them in a kind of a form of self-fulfilling prophecy. So this book follows, essentially there are, I would say, four main characters. The first one is Joe Christmas, who I would say is the main character, and he is a young man working a menial job in a town who is apparently of mixed race. He was an orphan, and everyone says that he's half black, half white, and you'll see how that affects him in the novel. The other one is Joe Brown, who is a kind of no good, small town, I don't know what word to use for him, runaround. He has a young woman or girl who has been, who he has knocked up, and she's looking for him, and he's trying to kind of get away from that. So then we have Byron Bunch is one of the other main characters. He works at the sawmill in this town with Christmas and Brown, and he is the one to meet the young girl who's looking for Brown, and he falls in love with her. And then finally, the last main character is Reverend Hightower, who came to this town as a young man to preach, and essentially was shamed into abandoning his position as preacher, and now is kind of a hermit who lives on the outskirts of town. The other main thing that we'll notice in this book is there's a strong recurring motif of light versus darkness. I mean, the title of the book is Light in August, and that motif is kind of used for several different things. Mainly light is used to refer to truth or the revelation of truth. But also we see it as a huge motif with Christmas. Like I said, he thinks himself as half white and half black, and so there is that motif of him experiencing, quote, the light and the dark sides of himself. And as we know, Faulkner lived and wrote in a time where racism was still the law of the land and was still extremely prevalent openly, and so we see a ton of that play out in Christmas's character and through that motif of light and dark. Yeah, so without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and start getting into the quotes that I've chosen. Again, just to reiterate, this isn't kind of a cohesive summary or a cohesive analysis of the entire book. These are just quotes that I thought played into the main ideas, and that I found were really nice to read and exemplified the style and beauty of the book. So yeah, we'll get into it. Alright, so first quote. The brother worked in the mill. All the men in the village worked in the mill or for it. It was cutting pine. It had been there 7 years, and in 7 years more it would destroy all the timber within its reach. Then some of the machinery, and most of the men who ran it and existed because of and for it, would be loaded onto freight cars and moved away. But some of the machinery would be left, since new pieces could always be bought on the installment plan. Gaunt, staring, motionless wheels rising from mounds of brick rubble and ragged weeds with a quality profoundly astonishing, and gutted boilers lifting their rusting and unsmoking stacks with an air stubborn, baffled and bemused, upon a stump-pocked scene of profound and peaceful desolation, unplowed, untilled, gutting slowly into red and choked ravines beneath the long quiet rains of autumn, and in the galloping fury of vernal equinoxes. Then the hamlet, which at its best day had borne no name listed on Post Office Department annals, would not now even be remembered by the hookworm-ridden heirs-at-large who pulled the buildings down and burned them in cook stoves and winter grates. So we see here, I think I chose this as the first one just because it's an amazing example of how Faulkner sets a scene. We have kind of this onslaught of industrialism and capitalism, the wake of destruction it leaves behind, the desolation, right? The peaceful desolation, as it says, through all this incredible imagery and the personification of the industrial machinery left behind to rust. It perfectly sets this air of irreversible destruction, and it evokes the poverty of the industrial era, in a kind of in a way without even talking about the people as much, right? We're seeing mostly this machinery left behind. There's also this idea of the way in which it took advantage of and used the least fortunate. Right? It says that the hamlet, which at its best day had borne no name listed on the Post Office Department annals. So this tiny little town, which doesn't even have a name, was used up and spat out just like countless of the poor and less fortunate people that were used up and killed in industrial labor. Just a really disturbing scene. So here the first few scenes are following this young girl who, as I said, is searching for Joe Brown, who she knows as Lucas Birch. He gave her a fake name. And all these strangers are helping her kind of look for him and get to the town. So she's heavily pregnant just walking by herself. But this man, one of the men who helps her, he has this thought. A man, all men. He will pass up 100 chances to do good for one chance to meddle where meddling is not wanted. He will overlook and fail to see chances, opportunities for riches and fame and well-doing, and even sometimes for evil, but he won't fail to see a chance to meddle. Then his tongue found words, he listening perhaps with the same astonishment that she did. Only I wouldn't set too much store in, thinking. She is not listening. If she could hear words like that, she would not be getting down from this wagon, with that belly and that fan and that little bundle, alone, bound for a place she never saw before, and hunting for a man she ain't going to ever see again, and that she has already seen one time too many as it is. Any time you are passing back this way, tomorrow or even tonight. I reckon I'll be all right now, she said. They told me he is there. So this kind of assessment of mankind, right? Man is always finding ways to meddle. And he's talking about Joe Brown, and he's kind of even talking about himself. Right? He has this impetus, this impulse to kind of, quote, do the right thing and tell this girl that, you know, this guy left you. He's not looking to be found. You should just go back to your family. And then he thinks to himself, she's not going to listen anyway. And she does kind of have this naive optimism about finding and reuniting with this man. And so maybe he's right that she wouldn't listen, but we have this kind of example of a self-fulfilling prophecy where, because he has this feeling about men that, all we do is meddle, right? There's no point in doing the right thing. She's not going to listen anyway. It's not going to do any good. He foregoes this chance entirely to maybe save this girl some trouble. But, personally, I think he's right in her assessment that he's right in his assessment of her that she wouldn't listen to him. There are several people who try to tell her, but she, of course, is dead set on finding, Joe Lucas as she knows him. So here we're introduced to the character of Reverend Hightower. He comes to the town as a young man and with a wife, and is preaching from the pulpit very fervently, mostly about his grandfather who was killed in the Civil War fighting for the South. And that's apparently all he can preach about. So here's what it says about Hightower. It was as if he couldn't get religion, and that galloping cavalry and his dead grandfather shot from the galloping horse untangled from each other, even in the pulpit, and that he could not untangle them in his private life, at home either, perhaps. Perhaps he did not even try to at home, Byron thought, thinking how that is the sort of thing that men do to the women who belong to them, thinking that that is why women have to be strong and should not be held blamable for what they do with or for or because of men, since God knew that being anybody's wife was a tricky enough business. They told him how the wife was a small, quiet-looking girl who at first the town thought just had nothing to say for herself. But the town said that if Hightower had just been a more dependable kind of man, the kind of man that a minister should be, instead of being born about 30 years after the only day he seemed to have ever lived in, that day when his grandfather was shot from the galloping horse, she would have been all right too. So here is something I find interesting, is that Byron, Faulkner, I think, through Byron, is sympathizing with women generally here, at a time where a lot of women didn't really have a say in their own identity, that they were kind of attached to the men that they were married to, right? The women who belonged to them. It's, the property. Women were property. We have this young woman who will never really know her identity because she was just run ragged to the bone by her fanatical husband. Right? The only things we know about her is that she cries a lot, and I believe she died young as well. And so that's another example of this greater theme of society deciding identities for someone. Right? She doesn't have an identity of her own, and Hightower really doesn't either. His whole identity seems to be based off of his grandfather dying a heroic death in a war, and so that's his whole identity, his whole character is kind of based off, like it said, this moment that happened 30 years before he was born, and so you have this really tragic pairing of a man who kind of denies himself an identity, and in doing so denies his wife an identity as well. Now, even then, Hightower, even though he is kind of ousted from his position and made to live on the outskirts, he still gets to go live a life what little life it is, right? But his wife does not. So just an example of that power dynamic. So we switch now to Joe Christmas. I think this is some of our first point of view from him. And he is an adult in this chapter, right? We do get some flashbacks a little later, but he's an adult here, working at the sawmill. And here we see him struggling with his mixed race identity. So he's just been running through the black part of town, where it's kind of a shanty area, where there's a lot of obviously black men and women living, and he's run from that area of town to the white area of town. Then he became cool. The Negro smell, the Negro voices were behind and below him now. To his left lay the square, the clustered lights, low bright birds in still-winged and tremulous suspension. To the right the street lamps marched on, spaced, intermittent, with bitten and unstirring branches. He went on slowly again, his back toward the square, passing again between the houses of white people. There were people on these porches too, and in chairs upon the lawns, but he could walk quiet here. Now and then he could see them, heads in silhouette, a white blurred garmented shape. On a lighted veranda 4 people sat about a card table, the white faces intent and sharp in the low light, the bare arms of the women glaring smooth and white above the trivial cards. That's all I wanted, he thought. That don't seem like a whole lot to ask. So you see here, he's associating whiteness with this kind of peaceful tranquility, this domesticity, this freedom from turmoil, right? That's all I wanted. That don't seem like a whole lot to ask. And we'll actually see that, interesting enough, this phrase return later, and so we'll come back to that. But for Christmas, who's been kind of haunted his whole life by this idea, this quote, darkness within him, all he really wants is to be white, because to him, being white means he's free from persecution and can just live his life and be who he wants to be. But we'll return to this identity later on, because there's a really important part about this identity. But all I'll say for now is that he seems, for all intents and purposes, to pass as a white man. Most of the characters in this book don't treat him like a black person, so he's feeling all this struggle internally, even though most people just see him as a white person. So it's a really interesting kind of, like, again, external perception, right? He was told by certain people that he was half black or had mixed blood in him, and so now he can't escape this idea that he's haunted by that part of himself. And at this time, living in a very racist South, it makes sense as to why he would be so afraid of this identity. So as I said, we do get some flashbacks from Christmas, and this is the first flashback. He was raised in an orphanage, and a lot of his kind of trauma relating to his race comes from this time period. So this is how this chapter starts. Memory believes before knowing remembers, believes longer than recollects, longer than knowing even wonders. Knows, remembers, believes, a corridor in a big, long, garbled, cold, echoing building of dark red brick, soot-bleakened by more chimneys than its own, set in a grassless, cinder-strewn, packed compound, surrounded by smoking factory purlieus, and enclosed by a 10-foot steel and wire fence like a penitentiary or a zoo, where in random erratic surges, with sparrow-like child trebling, orphans and identical in uniform blue denim, in and out of remembering, but in knowing constant as the bleak walls, the bleak windows, wherein rain soot from the yearly adjacenting chimneys streaked like black tears. If you didn't really understand that, that's okay. This is kind of where Faulkner gets into his more Faulkner stuff. That more experimental stream of consciousness, very surreal, impressionistic maybe. So memory believes before knowing remembers. How I interpret that line is that all the trauma of our childhood, right? All those tiny little memories or happenings that give us our bad habits, our neuroses, our fears, our insecurities. Right? We don't have to remember the concrete details of those memories for them to affect us. And so what I think this means is that our beliefs about ourselves are founded on these memories that we maybe couldn't even recall if we were asked, but they still affect us in a really deep way. And we believe the truths that they tell us without having to remember the details. Does that make sense? I'm asking nobody right now. I guess it's a way of saying that trauma and identity, the pieces of it that we get from childhood, are more intuitive than conscious. They're buried within us more so than explicitly available for us to recall. So we have here a very impressionistic description of this orphanage, which is described in kind of, it's very industrial and kind of scary, and big, long, garbled, cold, echoing building, dark red bricks, soot-bleakened, grassless, cinder-strewn, packed compound, steel and wire fence like a penitentiary or zoo. We have all these images coming together to form the impression of how this place must have felt for Christmas, how it must have felt like a penitentiary or a zoo. He was 6 years old when he left, but obviously he remembers this feeling of being trapped here and suffocated. To me, it sounds like, right? It mentions the smoke and the soot several times. So it's just a very interesting way of describing childhood memories, which often are very kind of foggy and diffuse. So I did not mark the quote in here, but this kind of flashback section is the first time where someone tells Christmas that he's half black and half white. And of course that's one of the things that forms the core part of his identity. But this part comes from after he's adopted. He's adopted by a very hard and unforgiving man named McEachern. I think I'm pronouncing that right. I could not be, but it doesn't really matter for our purposes, right? McEachern. And they go home, and he meets the wife, Mrs. McEachern, and there's this paragraph that I'll read. Later, she put him to bed. For 2 years almost he had been dressing and undressing himself, unnoticed and unassisted save by occasional Alice's. He was already too tired to go to sleep at once, and now he was puzzled and hence nervous, waiting until she went out so he could sleep. Then she did not go out. Instead, she drew a chair up to the bed and sat down. There was no fire in the room. It was cold. She had a shawl now about her shoulders, huddled into the shawl, her breath vaporizing as though she were smoking. And he became wide awake now. He was waiting for the part to begin which he would not like, whatever it was that he had done. He didn't know that this was all. This had never happened to him before either. So right just prior to this, Mrs. McEachern washes his feet. And obviously just afterwards she puts him to bed and sits and watches him sleep, and he's very confused. He's confused because what he's never experienced before, right, is love. Right, this woman who has not been able to have a child of her own finally has one, and she's trying to express her love and care for him. And he's waiting for the part that he would not like, right? Because in every instance beforehand, any experience that could have been love, unconditional love or care, has been cut short by something else, some kind of mean act or someone doing something bad to him. And so he greets love with a kind of suspicion, and he doesn't feel like he deserves it. Could this, he didn't know that this was all. And what's really heartbreaking about this, as we'll see, is that he never really learns to accept it. That he goes from being a loveless child to having an opportunity for love and totally rejecting it because he can't accept that he deserves it. Going back to that, memory believes before knowing remembers. He's already come to believe that he is unlovable, and that really kind of sums up his character, and it's just heartbreaking. So jump forward a little bit. He's a teenager now. He's still in the McEachern home. McEachern has proven to be he's extremely religious, but extremely controlling parent. Not even really a parent, more so just a kind of boss, or a prison keeper. So Joe has been sneaking out and seeing a woman, and she's older than him, and she's a prostitute, and he brings her to a dance, and McEachern finds out about it somehow and goes after him. So this is the scene where McEachern comes in and confronts Joe at the dance. Perhaps it did not seem to him that he had been moving fast, nor that his voice was loud. Very likely he seemed to himself to be standing just and rock-like, and with neither haste nor anger, while on all sides the sluttishness of weak human men seethed in a long sigh of terror about the actual representative of the wrathful and retributive throne. Perhaps they were not even his hands which struck at the face of the youth whom he had nurtured and sheltered and clothed from a child, and perhaps when the face ducked the blow and came up again, it was not the face of that child. But he could not have been surprised at that, since it was not that child's face which he was concerned with. It was the face of Satan, which he knew as well. And when, staring at the face, he walked steadily toward it with his hand still raised, very likely he walked toward it in the furious and dreamlike exaltation of a martyr who has already been absolved, into the descending chair which Joe swung at his head, and into nothingness. Perhaps the nothingness astonished him a little, but not much, and not for long. So McEachern here sees himself as the kind of delivering hand of God's wrath. Right, he sees Joe as the very face of Satan. And this is a topic I would love to get into if I do more videos on Faulkner, which I would like to do. Faulkner, for all his being born in the South and writing in the early 1900s, right? He seems extremely critical of the South, and that criticism includes obviously not only the racism of the South, but it seems also to include the fanatical, the zealotry, right? The religious fervor, which so many people use to excuse their actions, right? So McEachern has been abusing this child for years and years, and he truly believes he's doing the right thing because, he's fighting Satan. He's in a war of good versus evil, and you see that as a tool used not only individually but on a grander scale as well, right? To this method of propaganda where you say that our side is good and their side is the devil, right? It's a war of good versus evil, and so you can see MacEachern as this kind of, I think, a very realistic depiction of a super religious person, using that religion to do terrible things. But you can also see it as a microcosm of those parties that would utilize religion and God as a tool in order to justify whatever it is they do. I try not to get too into politics here, naming names, but some of you probably have some examples that come to mind, and I would probably have the same examples come to my mind. Another thing I find very interesting here, this use of the word sluttishness. Now, this is a very loaded term, I think, in modern times, because it's often a very misogynistic term, right, used to demean women. But here it's used to demean specifically weak human men, right? In other places in this book, we kind of see that MacEachern has this idea that women don't really have responsibility. It's men are the only ones with this higher power for moral thinking, and so to him it's like the fact that it's men who are responsible for evil. But just, it's interesting, I have not seen that term slut or sluttishness used in that way, and it could be a kind of antiquated use, but either way it's an interesting inversion of that idea that we have of it as a term used to demean women. So Joe cracks MacEachern's head open with a chair, and he dies. So Joe ends up running away. Okay. So Joe has been. This is back to when he's an adult, and he's been staying in the cabin on the property of this woman who owns it, and this woman has a very complicated history. She's telling Christmas about it. They've been sleeping together, and she's been feeding him, but they don't really. I can't really figure out their relationship. Probably should have said spoilers at the beginning, but honestly, it's really hard to spoil Faulkner because there's so much value you get that's not in the plot. But basically, they go through this period. He kind of breaks into her home. She feeds him. They start sleeping together. He kind of forces her to at first, though it's not clear how much she invited him, and that's problematic. So it's really hard to tell how much of it was consensual and how much was not. So it's probably at least partially non-consensual. But they do develop a relationship, and she falls in love with him. But the relationship ends with him murdering her. But anyway, she has a complicated family history. Her family was some abolitionists, and all her family dies and is buried. And this is a very short quote here, but I'll just go ahead and read it. So she says that, racists and slaveholders may have dug up their graves and desecrated them. And Christmas says, they might have done that, dug them up after they already killed, dead. Just when do men that have different blood in them stop hating one another? This is about as on the nose as Faulkner gets, right? Just when do men with different blood in them stop hating one another? Right, this kind of really blatant criticism of of racism at a time where it was still very normal, right? And this is Christmas asking, I think, on a broad level, but also for himself, right? Like, when do men that have different blood in them stop hating one another? I think he's also asking about those different bloods within himself, right? That he thinks is the case, right? When will he stop hating himself? So I think this reflects his views of society and himself as well. I just wanted to point that out because Faulkner usually isn't so blatant with questions like that, but it's interesting. So as I said, Joe Christmas does end up killing the woman he was staying with, and then the house burns down, and this is part of the aftermath. Then there was nothing for them to look at except the place where the body had lain and the fire. And soon nobody could remember exactly where the sheet had rested, what earth it had covered, and so then there was only the fire to look at. So they looked at the fire with that same dull and static amaze which they had brought down from the old fetid caves where knowing began, as though, like death, they had never seen fire before. Presently the fire truck came up gallantly, with noise, with whistles and bells. It was new, painted red, with gilt trim, and a hand-power siren, and a bell gold in color, and in tone serene, arrogant, and proud. About it hatless men and youths clung with the astonishing disregard of physical laws that flies possess. It had mechanical ladders that sprang to prodigious heights at the touch of a hand, like opera hats, only there was now nothing for them to spring to. It had neat and virgin coils of hose, evocative of telephone trust advertisements in the popular magazines. But there was nothing to hook them to, and nothing to flow through them. So the hatless men, who had deserted counters and desks, swung down, even including the ones who ground the siren. They came to and were shown several different places where the sheet had lain, and some of them, with pistols already in their pockets, began to canvass about for someone to crucify. But there wasn't anybody. She had lived such a quiet life, attended so to her own affairs, that she bequeathed to the town in which she had been born and lived and died a foreigner, an outlander, a kind of heritage of astonishment and outrage, for which, even though she had supplied them at last with an emotional barbecue, a Roman holiday almost, they would never forgive her and let her be dead in peace and quiet. Not that. Peace is not that often. So they moiled and clotted, believing that the flames, the blood, the body that had died 3 years ago and had just now begun to live again, cried out for vengeance, not believing that the rapt-in fury of the flames and the immobility of the body were both affirmations of an attained born beyond the hurt and harm of man. Not that. So there's a lot here. Obviously, read a lot of words. Now this woman was kind of also a hermit, like Hightower, and she lived out beyond the reach of anybody, right? Because the town hated her ancestors, right? Because she was against slavery, and she also helped black people and business owners with bookkeeping, right? She did that a lot. She wrote letters and attended business affairs for a lot of different black people, and they hated her for that. Not the black people, the white townsfolk hated her for that. But now, once she's dead, and once it comes to be known that a black man did it, right, Christmas, suddenly they're up in arms, and they have this, right, this Roman holiday, right? They have someone to go after. And it's really amazing to me the contrast between the right, the brand new shiny fire truck, right? It describes just how beautifully made it is. You know, it's shiny and painted red, and the golden bell, and all these men are attached to it, and the bell is arrogant and proud, right? This amazing fire truck is coming to the scene of a murder and a fire that's already burned a house to the ground, right? There was nothing for the hose to hook to, no water to flow through it. It's completely impotent and useless, and yet it comes with such bombast and arrogance. It's just that contrast between the appearance the people put on and what they can actually do, right? How much they actually care for this woman, which is really not at all. They really hate her. And, you know, so this fire truck comes with, and ostensibly to put out a fire, but all it does is bring more people with guns to search for the murderer and the arsonist. Just a great scene. So Byron, bunch and Hightower have been talking a lot. And Byron, having fallen in love with the young girl searching for Lucas Birch or Joe Brown, has come to Hightower several times for advice, and Hightower knows what Byron wants to do, and he's really disappointed in him, but he hears about the murder and the fire, and he seems to be at his wit's end with Byron and with the town. So here it says, Hightower thinks it is because so much happens, too much happens, that's it. Man performs, engenders, so much more than he can or should have to bear. That's how he finds out that he can bear anything. That's it. That's what's so terrible. That he can bear anything, anything. So he's come to this kind of moment, this, I guess you can, the dark night of the soul, right? Where the character is tested for their endurance of what they can withstand, and what Hightower finds out is that a human can bear almost anything. Right? There's no bottom to how terrible things can get. Right? There's another quote, and it's actually from Stella Maris by Cormac McCarthy, and I might put it up on screen because I really love it. Basically what it says is that there seems to be a ceiling to joy, right? You can only be so happy, but there doesn't seem to be any similar floor to sorrow, right? As low as you go, it can always get worse. And that's kind of a fundamental aspect of humankind, is that there's no floor to sorrow. Okay, this is after Byron is leaving Hightower's house. Well, I'll read it and then I'll talk about it a little. And Hightower leans there in the window, in the August heat, oblivious of the odor in which he lives, that smell of people who no longer live in life, that odor of over-plump desiccation and stale linen, as though a precursor of the tomb, listening to the feet which he seems to hear still long after he knows that he cannot, thinking, God bless him, God help him. Thinking, to be young, there is nothing else like it. There is nothing else in the world. He is thinking quietly, I should not have got out of the habit of prayer. Then he hears the feet no longer. He hears now only the myriad and interminable insects leaning in the window, breathing the hot, still, rich, maculate smell of the earth, thinking of how when he was young, a youth, he had loved darkness, of walking or sitting alone among trees at night. Then the ground, the bark of trees, became actual, savage, filled with, evocative of, strange and baleful half-delights and half-terrors. He was afraid of it. He feared. He loved in being afraid. Then one day while at the seminary, he realized that he was no longer afraid. It was as though a door had shut somewhere. He was no longer afraid of darkness. He just hated it. He would flee from it, to walls, to artificial light. Yes, he thinks, I should never have let myself get out of the habit of prayer. He turns from the window. One wall of the study is lined with books. He pauses before them, seeking, until he finds the one which he wants. It is Tennyson. It is dog-eared. He has had it ever since the seminary. He sits beneath the lamp and opens it. It does not take long. Soon the fine galloping language, the gutless swooning full of sapless trees and dehydrated lusts, begins to swim smooth and swift and peaceful. It is better than praying without having to bother to think aloud. It is like listening in a cathedral to a eunuch chanting in a language which he does not even need to not understand. So we have here, right, light and darkness. And I think darkness here, light and darkness are, right, like I said earlier, being used as truth and ignorance. He used to love darkness, right? Maybe it's this naive ignorance, this innocence about the world. And then he comes to fear it, right? The unknown, fear of the unknown. And then after a certain point, he's no longer afraid. He just hates the darkness. He despises ignorance. But I think what's ironic here, and at least how I interpret the scene, is that, you know, I should not have got out of prayer, right? Prayer is a way for religious people to kind of seek truth or enlightenment. But here, he laments the fact that he's not prayed in a while, but then he goes and opens this book. It's Tennyson. And I believe it's a book of poetry. This book that he has a habit of reading, that he's, dog-eared. He's had it since the seminary, and he just lets the language wash over him. And to me, I think this is kind of a retreat into apathy. He goes into this world of language, right? A gutless swooning in sapless trees, a world that doesn't really exist, so that he doesn't have to deal with the real world anymore. And I think this very last line is very interesting. It's like listening in a cathedral to a eunuch chanting in a language which he does not even need to not understand. Right? To not understand, I think, implies an attempt to understand. Right? At least a listening, right? A processing of the language. But I think it's here saying that, that he's so used to these words that they just kind of wash over him, and I don't think they really mean anything anymore. It's just a way for him to escape the truth in his life. That's my interpretation, at least. So we're back to Christmas, Joe Christmas, and here I'm gonna bring up the fact that really changes his struggle with his mixed blood. Right? We learn that he was an orphan because this girl, Millie, got pregnant by someone, a stranger basically, and then that stranger was murdered by her father. And her father, this man, Doc, I think old Doc is what they call him, he insists that the stranger was black, and Millie denies this. Right? Now what happens then is that Millie is pregnant and she goes into labor, and her mother tries to get a doctor, and old Doc refuses, and she essentially stands outside and lets her die in labor, because he hates this idea that she would be giving birth to a mixed child so much. Now the interesting part, right, is that the stranger, who Doc insists was black and Millie insists was not, we don't know his identity. Right, so this insistence by several people throughout Christmas's life, right, this insistence to still call him black, is based on a completely unfounded, it's based on a rumor. Right? So Christmas has been struggling with this thing his whole life, and it might not even be true. Right? In today's day and age, we'd say, oh, it doesn't matter if it's true, right? But obviously back then it did matter. If you had black blood in you, you were black, and you were treated as such. And so there's this whole crew trying to lynch Christmas now after the murder. He's escaped custody. And so that to me is the most interesting part, is that Christmas lives his whole life in his identity and struggles with a rumor, right? That he has internalized as fact, even though for all we know it could just be made up. And it's really tragic and upsetting. So this paragraph, again, is when he's on the run. It says, "It is just dawn, daylight, that gray and lonely suspension filled with the peaceful and tentative waking of birds. The air, inbreathed, is like spring water. He breathes deep and slow, feeling with each breath himself diffuse in the neutral grayness, becoming one with the loneliness and quiet that has never known fury or despair. That was all I wanted, he thinks, in a quiet and slow amazement. That was all for 30 years. That didn't seem to be a whole lot to ask in 30 years. So we see again this phrase, right, that didn't seem to be a whole lot to ask. Right? And last time we heard that was when he was running from the black part of town to the white part of town, and whiteness is what he thinks he wanted, right? But now he's essentially on the run from the police, right? And this is the kind of the first moment of peace that he has felt in what seems to be his whole life, right? A quiet that has never known fury or despair. And fury and despair are all he's ever known. And so he realizes now, on the run, alone, in the wilderness, that what he wanted was just peace. And it's really heartbreaking. I don't think I can say Christmas is a good person, but it's an example of a person that was never really given a chance to be good, if that makes sense. And so he has this moment, again, this moment of peace and quiet only when he's on the run. And maybe it's that he's, for now, for the moment, out of reach of society and the people that prescribe an identity to him and want to hurt him. Yeah, it's really interesting. And so now the townsfolk are telling the story, and so I'll read that. And then he walked the streets in broad daylight, like he owned the town, walking back and forth, and with people passing him a dozen times and not knowing it, until Halliday saw him and ran up and grabbed him and said, "Ain't your name Christmas?" And the black said that it was. He never denied it. He never did anything. He never acted like either a black or a white man. That was it. That was what made folks so mad. For him to be a murderer, and all dressed up and walking the town like he dared them to touch him, when he ought to have been skulking and hiding in the woods, muddy and dirty and running. It was like he never even knew he was a murderer, let alone a black too. So what infuriates people here is that Christmas is not living the way that their prescribed identity says he should be, right? He should be running and hiding like the murderer and the black that he is, and he's not. He kind of gives up. He goes into town, gets himself a haircut, buys some clothes, and he just waits for someone to catch him. And they hate that because, there's nothing of the Christmas that they built in their heads in that image, right? He's supposed to be this dirty, no good scoundrel, and he gives himself up essentially. So Byron comes to Hightower's bed to tell him that the young woman who is carrying Joe Brown's baby is in labor now, and he needs Hightower to come help him. And he's put Hightower through so much throughout the story that he's just dreading having to put him through more. So here's what it says. He approached the bed. The still invisible occupant snored profoundly. There was a quality of profound and complete surrender in it, not of exhaustion, but surrender, as though he had given over and relinquished completely that grip upon that blending of pride and hope and vanity and fear, that strength to cling to either defeat or victory, which is the I am, and the relinquishment of which is usually death. Standing beside the bed, Byron thought again, a poor thing, a poor thing. It seemed to him now that to wake the man from that sleep would be the sorest injury which he had ever done him. But it ain't me that's waiting, he thought. God knows that, because I reckon he has been watching me too lately, like the rest of them, to see what I will do next. So the reason I marked this quote is, again, remember the last time we saw Hightower, he was kind of diving back into Tennyson, right? Through my analysis, through my impression, giving up on caring about what was happening in the world and just returning to a comfortable, well-loved book. And Byron intuits that, right? It seems to him that Hightower has completely given up his ego entirely, right? Which is the I am. Right? And I think this is interesting because I am, right, could also be a reference to God answering Moses' question in the Bible, right? I am that I am. And that would be notable because Hightower also left religion, right? He gave up on religion. And so Byron sees this man now who has neither his ego nor his God anymore, and he has to steel himself to ask more of him, ask him to give more of himself. Yeah. So Byron, who I've mentioned has been in love with this woman with the baby. He knows, well, they've brought Joe Brown to the woman's cabin, right, to meet the baby and to be reunited with her. And Byron, recognizing that, she and Joe are going to be together, he decides to, take his lumps and ride away and accept that he fell in love with a woman who never wanted him to begin with. And so he's riding away, and it says this. The mild red road goes on beneath the slanting and peaceful afternoon, mounting a hill. Well, I can bear a hill, he thinks. I can bear a hill, a man can. It is peaceful and still, familiar with 7 years. It seems like a man can just about bear anything. He can even bear what he never done. He can even bear the thinking how some things is just more than he can bear. He can even bear it that if he could just give down and cry, he wouldn't do it. He can even bear it not to look back, even when he knows that looking back or not looking back won't do him any good. The hill rises, cresting. He has never seen the sea, and so he thinks it is like the edge of nothing. Like once I passed it, I would just ride right off into nothing, where trees would look like and be called by something else except trees, and men would look like and be called by something else except folks. And Byron Bunch, he wouldn't even have to be or not be Byron Bunch. Byron Bunch and his mule, not anything, with falling fast, until they would take fire like the Reverend Hightower says about them rocks running so fast in space that they take fire and burn up, and there ain't even a cinder to have to hit the ground. But then, from beyond the hill crest, there begins to rise that which he knows is there, the trees which are trees, the terrific and tedious distance which, being moved by blood, he must compass forever and ever between two inescapable horizons of the implacable earth. Steadily they rise, not portentous, not threatful. That's it. They are oblivious of him. Don't know and don't care, he thinks. Like they were saying, all right, you say you suffer. All right. But in the first place, all we got is your naked word for it. And in the second place, you just say that you are Byron Bunch. And in the third place, you are just the one that calls yourself Byron Bunch today, now, this minute. Well, he thinks, if that's all it is, I reckon I might as well have the pleasure of not being able to bear looking back too. He halts the mule and turns in the saddle. Another long passage there. But we have a reiteration of that idea Hightower found earlier, right? There's no floor to sorrow. A man can bear anything, even thinking he can bear something. And we have Byron attempting here a similar ego death to the one Hightower went through, right? This desire to escape himself, right, and not deal with the shame of being himself and being in this world. And so he imagines this place where trees are not trees and he is not Byron Bunch. And then he crests the hill and sees the trees that are trees, right? And to me, this is getting at the fact that he really has no say over who he is, right? You just say that you are Byron Bunch. You are the one that calls yourself Byron Bunch today, now, this minute. I think identity for Faulkner is an idea created for you. And I think it's a damaging idea. This idea of the obliviousness of the world, right? Don't know and don't care. This turmoil we put ourselves through over our identity when the world at large couldn't care less. Right? You say you suffer. All right. This whole section kind of gets at the powerlessness, I think, of being a human being. The powerlessness even to define yourself, right? And I don't know if I personally agree with that assessment, but I think it's a very interesting and cynical philosophy. I think Faulkner had a lot of reason for believing this to be the case, right, in the world he grew up in, especially like as we talked about as it relates to race, and even in gender in certain parts. All right, last quote. So this is talking about when Christmas escaped from custody. I think that is what gave him not the courage so much as the passive patience to endure and recognize and accept the one opportunity which he had to break in the middle of that crowded square, manacled, and run. But there was too much running with him, stride for stride with him, not pursuers, but himself. Years, acts, deeds omitted and committed, keeping pace with him, stride for stride, breath for breath, thud for thud of the heart, using a single heart. He was not alone all those 30 years which she did not know, but all those successions of 30 years before that which had put that stain either on his white blood or his black blood, whichever you will, and which killed him. But he must have run with believing for a while. Anyway, with hope. But his blood would not quiet, let him save it. It would not be either one or the other, and let his body save itself. Because the black blood drove him first to the Negro cabin, and then the white blood drove him out of there, as it was the black blood which snatched up the pistol, and the white blood which would not let him fire it. And it was the white blood which sent him to the minister, which, rising in him for the last and final time, sent him against all reason and reality, into the embrace of a chimera, a blind faith in something read in a printed book. Then I believe that the white blood deserted him for the moment, just a second, a flicker, allowing the black to rise in its final moment and make him turn upon that on which he had postulated his hope of salvation. It was the black blood which swept him by his own desire beyond the aid of any man, swept him up into that ecstasy out of a black jungle where life has already ceased before the heart stops and death is desire and fulfillment. And then the black blood failed him again, as it must have in crises all his life. He did not kill the minister. He merely struck him with the pistol and ran on and crouched behind that table and defied the black blood for the last time, as he had been defying it for 30 years. He crouched behind that overturned table and let them shoot him to death with that loaded and unfired pistol in his hand. So, what I find most interesting about this passage, and this is a townsman recounting his escape, right? So he's kind of intuiting all this. But what I think is most interesting is that you have Christmas, this incredibly complex and tragic character, who, like I said, I don't know if I can say is a good person, but is not an evil person either, right? He doesn't shoot at any of the people pursuing him, even though they mean to kill him. And what is interesting about this is that they try to categorize his actions into black and white blood, right? You might as well be saying evil and good, right? Because that's what they mean. And what they can't fathom is that this binary system, right? It disallows them from understanding Christmas as a complex and whole person. And so you have this tragedy of this man who is really a hurt child at heart, right? An unlovable, hurt child who commits a horrible act and then, has struggled with himself for his whole life and ends up being murdered. So, right, I think this is a condemnation of the limits of categorizing someone, right, based on race, and in a broader sense, trying to define someone really at all, right? Because all of us are complex and essentially unknowable, right? At a basic level, everyone is contradictory. Everyone is impossible to understand, right? Even to themselves fully. Yeah, I think it sums up the shortcomings of how humans perceive each other really well. Yeah. So that's all I have. Like I said, I loved this book. I do need to return to those Faulkners I've already read, right? Absalom, I think, would be my next favorite, but I would have to read it again. There's just, that book is so dense. But I would like to do a video on it. Yeah. Thank you for watching. Thank you for sitting along with me and talking about this book. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye.